talk about a Christian formation? What is it that we're doing when we meet as a community? It has to be, it seems, something more than spending time together, sharing hobbies, sharing times. Of course, it has to include that. If you don't have those things, sharing space, sharing lives, not real community either, but there seems to be a purpose. Now, I think we can answer that in different ways. What's the purpose of the church? What's the purpose of Christian community? I don't know if there is one answer, but seems to be throughout the context of especially the New Testament, that part of being in a Christian community involves formation, a growth together, a growth towards God, a growth of our own self, of an understanding of ourself and in our participation with others. And our readings and our disciplines and other things will inform this discovery in different ways. So we begin this class on community with talking about the elements that these disciplines themselves are going to contribute towards. Forming as Christian. Forming as a Christian community. Now there's a lot of different ways we can talk about formation. In fact, we could just talk about those ways and fill a whole semester's class. But that's not this class. This class isn't a history of theological interpretation. It's not a church history. I love those topics. I would certainly love to talk about those more deeply. This isn't even a class devoted just to Christian formation. This is a class on Christian community. So how can we talk about Christian formation in a way that brings some general themes together and helps us inaugurate our discussions throughout this quarter? Well, I'll begin with a few approaches to theological understanding. First, I'll begin with the Eastern Orthodox approach to Christian formation and Christian understanding, a Wesleyan approach to theological understanding, and then an approach I'll feature in this class, what I call pneumatological triangulation. See, now you're getting your money's worth. That's a good theology phrase. And that's just a good theology phrase, it's a fun phrase. Feel free to use it with your friends and family. Impress them with your theological acumen, and they'll be like, wow, you must go to seminary. See, it's just that simple. Beyond just the language, using fancy terms to say something more simply is just one of those minor joys of theological discussion, but it can often obscure as much as it helps. So really what I'm proposing as a way of putting that together is a method of theological discernment that examines a threefold work of the Holy Spirit in us and in this world in which I look at Scripture. Get to know this one, the idea, not the long label, because I really do encourage you to think about this as you respond throughout this class, as we respond together, to think in each of these categories. For now, let's start with the Eastern Orthodox approach. Vladimir Lossky says, Christianity is not a philosophical school for speculating about abstract concepts, but essentially a communion with the living God. What do you think about that? For Lossky, and for Eastern Orthodox theology in general, theology is by its very nature mystical. It taps into a deep part of ourselves. It's not just about an intellectual understanding and using words to describe attributes of God or other theological themes. It contends that theology is rooted in religious experience. What is your experience with God? What is your experience with walking with God? And then religious experience leads into theology. These inform each other. These reflect into each other. You can't understand God. You can't be a Christian theologian without having this engagement into the life and work of God. So often in the West, we talk about theology as this purely intellectual affair that you can even be not being a Christian. You don't have to be a Christian to talk about Christian theology. That's really just an unheard of idea for Eastern Orthodox. The idea that you could somehow have words that are trustworthy about God without engaging in this relationship doesn't make sense. The goal of the Christian is not to have a philosophical understanding of the divine, but rather to reach the point of union with God, to be in perfect relationship and unity with God. For this to occur, the Christian must learn how to become completely detached from human understanding. Leave aside your attempt to try to encapsulate God within some kind of set of categories or system or approach. When you do that way of knowing distorts, misleads understanding about God. Yes, we can find ways of beginning to understand, but then so often, rather than allowing that just to be an initial exploration, we then box God in and say, this is what God has to do. This is what God has to be. These words, these phrases sum up this divine presence who created the universe. So true theology in the Eastern conception is relational. And that means addressing our issues of understanding. The idea that we have to get a sense of knowledge, but we also have to understand God in terms of passion, our emotions, and our actions. How do we define a relationship? It's not just merely understanding someone. You can understand someone and not have any relationship with them. It's about engaging with them. It's about having an emotional response and also an enacted presence. It's not to say that nothing can be said about God. Well, we can't know the God who is, God in God's own essence, the God who is beyond all things, the God who made us. We can know the God who does things. God, we can experience God. God has chosen to interact, to reveal God's own self, to engage the world, to engage us. And these are elements then we can speak about. We can integrate those experiences with other people's experiences and reflections and go throughout history. And in gathering these together, we can come up with words about God. These don't encapsulate him, but they share what God has shared with us and with others throughout history. So what are our experiences? Well, one experience I had is connected to this painting. It's a picture of A Walk at Dusk by Caspar David Friedrich, which is found in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. When I was coming to the end of seminary or just after, and I was in a very strange point of my ministry life where I had this burgeoning community of young adults that was feeding me, and I was feeling like there was this wonderful activity happening on one side, a sense of calling and purpose, but on the other side I was in a low-level staff, and the senior leadership of the church was increasingly dysfunctional. I won't go into that, but there was a lot of politics and tension and other things that was causing a breaking apart of the church. And even though I wasn't directly involved in it, I was caught in the middle. And I found myself extremely discouraged, having come through this training, having found excitement in ministry and purpose and these conversations I was having, participating in the worship team and other elements. I felt like there was something wonderful possible. My experiences of church so far to that point had a lot of ups and downs, but this church in an earlier time, 10 years before, was part of some of the most amazing small group communities that I had ever experienced. There was this resonance of God's work, and some of those people were still there, and there was this sharing of history and purpose. But I was feeling pulled apart and felt betrayed and discouraged. And at the time, I tried to do more and more, and I was committed to doing as much as I could and not to give up, and to press on to do better, and to try to work my way into a better place. And the more I did, the more I got discouraged and depressed, and I just felt this hitting this wall. And so then I decided to take a day off and go to the Getty just to find some space away from the usual. And I just walked around the museum. It's a beautiful place in general, and walked into this room, and there was a small picture on the wall. There was this one. It grabbed me. I stared at it a while, and it felt peaceful. It reminded me God was not wanting me to do more. God was wanting me to be. He wasn't wanting me to perform, he was wanting me. And it struck me, even though this is a seemingly lonely picture, it doesn't resonate loneliness for me. It resonates quiet purpose. This man, this scholar, probably most doubt, is on his way from one place to another place. Maybe a place of busyness, of activity. But in this moment, he's walking in this ancient picture, this forest scene. And I realized that was what God was calling me into. I was becoming destructive. I was becoming hurt and torn apart, and I was letting that chaos in me resonate around. And even though I had good motives and was seeking God, I wasn't in a healthy place emotionally or spiritually. God was calling me, and to participate more fully in community, I needed to be formed, reformed, to step back and embrace the kind of presence with God that can only happen in times of stillness and focus. And so I moved to the mountains. I left active ministry, moved to the mountains, time of prayer. I had a Christian community of friends and family who were part of that network of regrowth, but a lot of it was finding this community with God, this formation with God, informed by a lot of readings and a lot of conversations and a lot of prayer and a lot of writings. My book, It's a Dance, formed out of this. Well, some other books. I can go on in this story, but I use this picture because this picture is this moment of experience with God that went beyond my theological words. I had finished my MDiv by this point. I had had undergraduate in theology and church history, and I didn't have words to know what was going on. I didn't know how to conceptualize it. So this experience with God drove me into a place where I didn't know what was happening, but I knew to trust it. And I knew to trust it because God said, come along. I'll give you the words. I'll give you understanding, but you have to walk with me. You have to let go the insistence on doing it the way you think it has to be done or the way other people are telling you it has to be done. Zacharias of Pontus, an early church leader, said this: if you are a theologian, you will pray truly. And if you pray truly, you are a theologian. It's about relationship with God. It's about being oriented in and with God. Maybe having the words, but sometimes we don't have the words, but the experiences drive us to find something deeper, more thorough. And in that holy angst, we can be people who participate with God, with others, more fully, even with ourselves. Pray more fully, pray more truly. And in that, we have words about God that have meaning. Theologos. Let's move on to Wesley. John Wesley was a pastor and evangelist and church leader, founder of the Methodist Church. His churches that formed out of his movement are extensive and now global. If we include Pentecostalism as being influenced by Wesley, massive influence, we can see this as being one of the most dynamic movements of the last few hundred years. Wesley was not a systematic theologian in that he didn't write a systematic theology, but he was a theologian. He was a practical theologian. He was a thoughtful theologian who responded times and issues as they rose in his sermons and in his journals and his other writings. A scholar, Albert Oefler, once wrote that he saw in Wesley ways of approaching theological interpretation, not things that Wesley spelled out, but these were the things that Wesley seemed to be doing. And Adler called this the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Start with Scripture, then you look at tradition. What are the reflections of Christian tradition throughout history? We were allowed to apply our own reason. What do we think about this context or this issue or this concern? We say the Spirit is with us, so we can't trust reason absolutely, but reason comes into being because God uses our mental faculties. And then experience. How are we experiencing God in this? And as I said, it's not a phrase used by Wesley, but it's a way of describing his functional approach to developing and arguing theological positions throughout his work. So in Christian formation, we can say we are formed in engaging these four elements together and integrating them, putting them in conversation, and in this we find growth and wisdom. So, and in this, we are called to live out our understanding in every area of life. That's part of Wesley's goal. You don't just have a mental understanding. Theology is something that is lived out. Here's another one, and I'll throw this one into the mix. Aristotle proposed 3 essential elements to persuasion, keys to demonstrating that what we say is true and is convincing to others and ourselves. Ethos, pathos, logos. This is more of an interlude in our description of theological interpretation. Aristotle, if you don't know, is not a Christian. Some like Clement of Alexandria and others said he had this understanding that was pointing towards truth and was making a path in terms of understanding. And so a lot of Christian theologians use these categories. And so we can see these as part of the discussions even that we've had so far. So let's talk about ethos. Think ethics. It's about our character. Are we believable? Are we trustworthy? Are we qualified to speak or be seen as authoritative? Why should someone listen to us? While authority and believability can be reflected in our credentials, you gain credentials by studying and by engaging things. Such credentials are not really as trustworthy. For instance, what if I were to say, I have a PhD in theology, so you have to believe me when I talk about God? There's no room for disagreement because do you have a PhD? Well, hopefully some of you are disturbed by that idea. I have a PhD, so I'm teaching this class. I have a PhD, so I have some measure of authority and experience. But I know enough PhDs to know that they often are not entirely right. In fact, the whole world of academia is PhDs arguing with each other over about who's right. So just having the credential doesn't mean they're right. I'm not saying don't believe me. I do. But don't believe me just because of the letters after my name. How am I using Scripture? How am I talking about my experience with God? Postmodern approaches show how rhetoric can be abused by those with power or privilege. We have no end of people who say this is the right thing to do, here's how you should live. But so often we realize people are telling other people what to do so that they can have power over them or they can gain some advantage. They don't do it themselves. So we look to actions. How do we live? We're living out what we teach and claim. If I were to say we should treat the environment better, but I don't recycle or I throw garbage everywhere, would you trust me? I hope not. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily wrong about encouraging you to care for the environment, but if I'm not doing it, what does that say about me? What does that say about my words? So ethos relates most closely in an ancient and contemporary sense to orthopraxy, the idea that we're doing something Do our actions reflect our faith in God? Do they confess the lordship of Christ in all areas of life? If not, what do our actions suggest? What do we have faith in? Sometimes our actions speak louder than our words. Our actions tell us what we actually believe in. And sometimes when we say we believe in God, what we really believe in is money or power or fame. What do we believe in? What are your actions? How you spent your time today say what you believe in? Let's move on to the next. Pathos, our feelings, passion, our instincts, essentially. They were dismissed during the modern period. But nowadays, how I feel about something is often used as a greater arbiter of personal truth than some claimed objective fact. I know that's true for you, but I feel like this. I feel like I am this thing, or I feel that this is true. How do you argue that? Our passions, our feelings become this primary motivator. I feel, therefore I am could be the postmodern declaration. I feel this is true is much more potent than I think this is true, even in our era. We define ourselves based on what we feel we are. It could be hope and joy, deep emotions, where we put our meaning and identity, or satisfaction, or even like negative emotions like anger and frustration. They're likewise fleeting, or fear and despair, these deep negatives, and yet we allow them to define and orient us, and define and orient how we view the world in an almost unimpeachable way. But where is our hope? All right, third, let's look at logos, our words. Presented in an argument in logical form. This really defined the modern approach to theology. I think, therefore I am, Descartes said. Very rational, very orderly. It prioritizes all of meaning around this logical development, often intellectualized and sometimes even distant from regular human experiences. The goal of the modern approach to knowledge was pure objectivity. And even though we realize this is impossible, it still becomes a primary method. The idea that you have to remove yourself and address things from this sort of outsider stance. Even a lot of essays and papers reflect this still, right? A lot of older approaches to formal writing says never use first person pronoun, never use I. I would say this author, or things like that. What it is it's trying to pose in some model of objectivity. Now, I disagree with that, but the writing center disagrees with me, so always ask your professor whether you should use the first person pronoun. I accept it, because we all know what you're talking about, and this is somehow this pose to put yourself outside of it is not as credible, and yet still becomes very influential in theological and Christian formation discussions. The idea that you were formed in sort of this categories of intellectualized belief, that Christian formation is about having the right understanding about doctrines, and the person who is the most fully Christian is the one who is able to most fully describe all the intricate nuances of various theological information. And this isn't all bad. This logos, their description, it defines our doctrines. It's a way of putting into words what God has done and how we understand God's work to be taking place in history. Can we tell the story of God's work? As I framed it a little more on the negative side in the early comment, now, can we tell the story of God's work? How do you talk about what God is doing, who God is, what God will do? Can you tell that story to those around you? Do you have words? Can we still tell our story in light of God's work? For instance, how do we explain pain? If you're in a church situation and a family's daughter develops leukemia, what do you say to them? What do you say to the family whose teenage daughter dies in a car accident when a drunk driver hits them? About the young man who drowns? Or, we can go on and on about some senseless tragedies or hurt and pain, or these crises of immediacy, or even these crises of global proportion. How do you talk about that? How do we talk about our need for God? These are all things that are part of our word, or developed understanding. Do we really even start from isolated thinking? Do we really? Is it just our brain, or do our experiences of life change our mental processes and interpretation? And this is an increasingly understood, that our brain is really plastic and adapts. I love the show Brain Games. If you ever get a chance to watch it, I think it's on Netflix now. It's this great way of showing how our brain adapts and even plays tricks on us to allow us to adapt to the world we live in. Your brain isn't always trustworthy, and yet we think that somehow our brain is this absolute objective interpretation of the world. Maybe our postmodern approach would be to say, I am this person, therefore I think. First comes the subject and then becomes the object, which then puts us into conversation about whose I am is primary. I am Patrick, therefore I think like Patrick. I am, God is, as he told Moses, therefore Patrick exists. Who's primary? Is it the I, me, or is it the I am God? Well, now we suddenly have a relative discussion in terms of relativity. What perspective do we take on thinking? What perspective do we take on what forms identity and meaning and purpose? It's coming out from a different direction. Kenneth Van Hooser, who's a very well-known theologian, writes this approach to triangulating theology. Theodramatic fittingness is the result of triangulating scripture, church, and world, cultural context. On what precisely do these three coordinates fix? The knowledge of God. God is the doable knowable. And to know God is to know what to say and do to glorify him in any given context. Theodramatic triangulation yields theodramatic understanding. In a word, sapientia, Christ, the wisdom of God. What do you think about that? Does that seem a helpful understanding of Christian formation? Scripture, church, world function here as 3 points of orientation. Are they sufficient? Well, each can be severed from God's true north, we can say, as an orienting absolute of God's nature and work. How do we know our knowledge of God is actually knowledge of the God who is? Each can also be distorted or co-opted. Indeed, the last two, church and world, may be unreliable guides, leading us to triangulate a position that works in our context, but is not an adequate reflection of God's calling for us in our context. It's not a prophetic engagement with our context, even though it may satisfy people's felt need or what they want to be true about the world. How many churches that are out there aren't really serving God as much as they're serving to support the lifestyle of the community they're in by adding a nice little bit of religious decoration or justification, just to help people do what they really want to do. What is our primary formation? What are we being formed into, and how can we orient this best? Schleiermacher, for instance, the founder of classical liberalism, shows how these three, scripture, church, world, can triangulate a very cohesive, it can really fit together in this nice package, but not be adequate theology. It doesn't mean anything for the people around it. You can have this great, this complex, this wonderfully rich theology, but it doesn't mean anything to anybody who hears it. It's not good news. I don't mean that they're rejecting it. It just has no connection with their life or issues or questions. So his establishment of liberal theology led to a contextualization in the world. He wanted theology to mean something, to connect with people, to have a resonance with their questions and concerns and approaches. But unfortunately, it lost a hope for the world that derives from the resurrection reality of Christ in spirit. In contrast, responses to such theology sought an objective sort of truth that could critique perception. We say, well, we can't trust ourselves and we can't trust those around us. So what we need is this nice package of things that we can say about God that isn't determined by our context or experiences. We want to be completely removed of those stories and just say, this is what Christianity is. But then the problem is they tended to reject any personal or emotional insights, and then increasingly began to dismiss social engagement. The idea that all you need to do to be a good Christian is have this package of knowledge about God, accept this, and you'll go to heaven. And that's all you need to do. The rest is just extraneous. Well, then you have the early 20th century battle between the fundamentalists versus the social gospel. On the one side, you had people who said, what people really need is Jesus and nothing else. It's just, we just are going to get our ticket to heaven. On the other side, people say, well, what Jesus says is to help the poor, and that's really all we need to do. There is nothing else. What is salvation? What is the good news? We have to come back to that question again and again when we think about Christian formation. What does it mean to be formed in Christ? Throughout history, theology and the church have swung from one side to the other, the objective to the subjective, or back from action, emphasizing just doing, to understanding, just think about it a lot, from introverted disciplines like prayer and study and the things that highlight those people who want to spend a lot of time in quiet, to extroverted disciplines like evangelism and social works, the people who just want to be out there doing things. And we tend to bounce back and forth. We're in an era of extroverts now. If you're extroverted, you get all the good gifts and the good rewards, and you're celebrated because those are the things we think the church should do. And yet, in our era, we've lost a sense of the depth and prayer and quiet. We need both. This is a holistic pursuit, yet we tend to be reactionary. Christian formation should be oriented towards becoming most fully who God has called us to be in our specific context. Who has God called you to be? What is your context that God has called you into? Who has God called you to be in that context? And that changes Christian formation, because then we orient our understanding of Christian formation in light of what God's doing in our lives now. We come to these disciplines with different spaces and ability with time and focus and purpose. And it's so easy to generalize and look at other people and say they're not doing it right just because they're not doing what we think we should do. Christian formation should be oriented towards becoming most fully who God has called us to be in our specific context. So, in light of that, I propose a different model of triangulation. And I said pneumatological triangulation. Well, what does that mean? Well, in this, I'm pointing towards triangulating discernment of the Spirit. They're saying triangulating discernment in general, triangulating how we need to be formed and where formation is directed towards, where we might go off track or where we might need to spend extra time. Orthodoxy, number one. Right, true, straight, orthos. Doxa, opinions, beliefs, so right beliefs. We should have a right understanding, a true understanding of who God is and what God is doing. But we can't stop there. Orthopathy, pathos, emotions, passions, suffering, but all those things that are packaged in our non-intellectual experiences and responses to life, in which our feelings, emotions, love, joy, pain, hurt, fear, all these things can be oriented by God. Look at the Bible. Those are all through. So the right feelings, the right passions. And then finally, orthopraxy, the right actions. What does God want us to do? What should we think? How should we feel? What should we do? In light of these things, in triangulating these things, we can be formed in terms of who Christ has called us to be in the context he has us. So orthodoxy, orthopathy, orthopraxy, this pneumatological triangulation, or just think of it as a dance. This interplay between these different elements of our beings and participation within this world and with God and with others. How do we grow in these? Well, it's not a direct or simple process. How do we grow in anything? How do we grow in understanding and wisdom in life? Well, there's different ways and methods, and we do what works, and we also listen to what has worked in eras past, and they've taught us. Catechesis, the teachings of the faith, the teachings of not just the words about God, but the actions and who we should be, the standards and ways we should behave and not behave. These aren't extraneous rules that get in the way. These are ways in which we say, we need to grow. We need to find humility in listening to those who have gone down this road farther than we have, who have different experiences than we have. So we learn from them. We learn from the teachings of those who have gone ahead of us in history, those who have known Christ, and those who were taught by those who knew Christ, and those who were taught by those who knew Christ. The tradition of the church gives us this way of understanding. We also enter into discipline and discernment. Like, how do you grow as an athlete or a musician? You practice. You do it. And sometimes the drills and the disciplines aren't directly related to the performance, playing a song or playing in a game, but there are ways of training us and training our minds and our muscles and our actions and our responses. You really can actually train your emotions, and you can train your responses, and all these things come through a discipline of engaging it in light of who God called us to be, and a discernment about where the Spirit is working and what the Spirit wants us to do. But we can't do this alone. Can you love alone? Not even God does that, right? God, we say, exists in eternal Trinity. Even God exists as God in community. And we think we're going to do it by ourselves? Right. No, God has called us into community. So part of the process of Christian formation has a communal element to it. Yes, there may be seasons or times in which we are called to step back, but it always should be oriented primarily in as part of our own growth as our own self in community. Practice and participation in community. So we ask, what are the ways we can teach and practice? Each so that we can sharpen our discernment, help others with our strength, get help with our weaknesses. These are all things we can do in community. We all do tend to be better at one of these. Some of us are really good thinkers, but we're really not in touch with our emotions. Some of us are really in touch with our emotions, but when we don't know how to do it, or we shy away from doing things. Some of us are doers, the Marthas among us. We're good at doing stuff. We don't want to think about it, and then we can do stuff in a disoriented way. So how do we find our strengths contributing to the community and also being informed in our weaknesses and be reminded about our weaknesses? I'm a pretty good thinker. If you want to know the Myers-Briggs, to use that, I'm an INTJ. I'm really caught in my mind and my imagination. and I'm a strong introvert, but yet I grew up around a family of strong feelers, very emotional people. So as part of my coping, both growing up and now being married, is learning how to understand and process my feelings in a way that is mature, because that was not the inherent way of understanding, that I become disassociated with my emotions, or my emotions are driving me even though I don't know how to understand it. So I've become mature in dealing with my emotional side, discerning in that. In fact, I've learned how God uses my experiences of joy and experience of depression in guiding and shaping my own directions. I'm kind of tuned to that as part of the process. But because I'm so introverted, because I'm trying to be so in tune with what God's doing, sometimes I can get caught in staying inside, doing study or reflection or sitting in nature. Well, I need to go out and do things. I need to go out and talk to people, and I need people around me who put me in context of social engagement. I'm not very good at small talk. So I need people who draw me in and help me make these connections with people to enter into better conversation, because how do you enter into a relationship without having these initial conversations? You need people who make those connections, who do things. One of my weaknesses, I know, is I can be a lot of talk. So I need to enact that. And so I'm a part of a church community so that they're doing things that then I can join in on. I know my weaknesses and I know my strengths, and I enter into community as a way of both contributing and receiving, being drawn out of my weaknesses and being able to contribute my strengths to those who might have other weaknesses. Because the tendency is to assume that the element we're inclined towards is a really important one. So why is it that Christian theology tends to prioritize orthodoxy above all things? Well, because you have a group of people and scholars who really are good at thinking and categorizing. And so they say these are the things that are important. Why is it that orthodoxy tends to not be as interesting to most people, even though they'll say it? Well, because they don't enact that in that way. That's not how they encounter life the best. So they say, well, what are we doing? What are we doing here? How do I feel? All these things have to be together, and we can't assume that just because we're good at something, that has to be the best one, or that has to be how everyone else is. A Christian community gathers together all these elements, and as a body, we live out the life of Christ in the power of the Spirit, in our strengths and in our weaknesses, mutually supporting, mutually informing each other. I like 1 Corinthians 3 because of this, where Paul is talking about growth. He begins by talking about the problems. These are the errors. These are the things you do. So I have to remind you and give you milk. But by the grace God has given me, he says in verse 10, I laid a foundation as a wise builder. Someone else is building on it. We're building this body. We're building this building, edification. The place Paul says is a purpose of the church, an edifice, a building. Edification is the edifying of each other, the building up of each other. Because don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? We are to be formed because God values us. Not just me as a teacher or professor, not just a pastor, not just the key leaders. Everyone in the body has been called and led by the Spirit to participate in the body, and so should be formed together as a body and built up as their part. That seems to be the core element of Christian formation. Let's move on to think about how then that might take shape in terms of stages and application, or at least understanding the complexity of it. It's easy to say let's be formed as Christians, but then to not understand what is it we are as people. I like this element of stages of faith. It's not a Christian focused, but it's a way of talking about stages of formation, because you're not going to teach 5-year-olds in the way you teach 40-year-olds. If you're teaching 40-year-olds the same stuff you're teaching 5-year-olds, something has gone terribly wrong. So we need to understand that at each stage of life, we're actually able to be formed in different ways, and we should be attentive to the formation that takes place in that area, and be attentive to how best we can maximize formation for that stage of life and stage of faith. You can, and so we also talk about stages of faith, because people can be young in the faith but old in age, or young in age but have more experience in the faith. Those who have grown up in the church have often more experience in Christian conversations in their early 20s than someone who has just come to church when they're 60. Now, that doesn't mean the person who's 60 is somehow less mature. It's just an understanding of faith, walking with God. And if we're teaching someone who's able to experience spiritual depth the same way as we're teaching a brand new Christian or someone just learning to hear about Christian, we can overwhelm them. But if we're teaching someone who's experienced in the faith and mature in the faith, and we keep feeding them milk, well, what's going to happen? They're going to starve. That's what happens in a lot of churches. We've so much in my experience, we've found this happy middle middle ground where the pastor and teachers tend to teach at their level of faith, and people who are too young don't know what to do with it, and people who are more mature or more advanced don't get anything out of it, and often just drift other places. So how can we be attentive to people's ages, stages of personality growth, personal formation, and also their faith formation? So James Fowler talks about stages of faith in terms of 6 main stages. Intuitive projective is the stage preschool children in which fantasy and reality get mixed together. But during this stage, our most basic ideas about God are usually picked up from our parents and society. So when I talk to my daughter, for instance, pretty young right now, how do I talk about it? Do I give her this complicated doctrine of theology like I would teach in my HT 501 class? No. We talk about God. God loves. We talk in ways that may be theologically imprecise, but are theologically applicable to her. The basic ideas of God that encounter her where she's at and understanding. Stage 2, when children become school age, they start understanding the world in more logical ways, the mythic, literal stage. They generally accept the stories told to them by their faith community, but tend to accept them in very literal ways. And some people remain in this stage throughout adulthood. They really take the stories for what they are, and if you're going to form them in Christianity, you can't make them become a different kind of person. Maybe you can lead them into a deeper understanding, but someone can be 40 and have a mythic, literal stage, and so it's not helpful to talk to in ways that is counter to that. How do you talk to them within that way that can lead them into a deeper stage? And if you're not aware that this is an actual stage of faith, then you can overwhelm them or undermine them, or oftentimes get into trouble because you're talking in a way that they just don't get, and then they'll categorize you as someone who's not talking about Christianity or talking about God. Stage 3, synthetic conventional. Most people move on to this stage as teenagers. At this point, their life has grown to include several different social circles, and there's a need to pull it all together. When it happens, someone usually adopts some sort of all-encompassing belief system, a life narrative, we can say. However, at this stage, people tend to have a hard time seeing outside their box. They have the story, and that's the story that fits the world. They don't recognize that they are inside this belief system. They think that this is the belief system that everyone has to hold, or that this way of telling a story is the same way. At this stage, authority is usually placed in individuals or groups that represent one's belief. This is a stage that many people remain in. This idea that there is this one way of telling the story. Talking about the way of organizing your belief system in terms of a set structure. So, for instance, more denominationally, only the Pentecostals are right, or only the Baptists are right, or this other group has totally off because they disagree with me on this element. Now you're starting to realize that. Think about people. Stage 4, individuative reflective stage. This is a tough stage, often begin in young adulthood when people start seeing outside the box and realize that there are other boxes. They start examining their own beliefs on their own, become disillusioned with their former faith, especially if their former faith hadn't given them a way to understand how to contextualize. Without an ability to contextualize, they think that they've been told this story their whole life, and because there's other stories, that their own story is somehow deficient. Ironically, the stage 3 people usually think that stage 4 people have become backsliders, when in reality they're actually moving forward. So you have a lot of, for instance, people who come out of college, even a lot of Christian colleges, who experience this stage where now they're questioning their faith and they leave it behind, and people think, oh no. Well, that's sometimes part of the journey. If we can come alongside them and help them reorient in light of the complexity and contextuality of life and stories and faith and God's work. Stage 5. Conjunctive faith. It's rare for people to reach this stage before midlife. This is a point when people realize the limits of logic, start to accept the paradoxes in life. They see life as a mystery. So in certain sense, they're retreating backwards, a second naivete, we can even say, a return to the sacred stories and symbols, but not without being stuck in a theological box of narrowness. It's accepting of different contexts and perspectives, but seeing this now as a way of understanding God's work in their life is important without having to have control over it. Stage 6, universalizing faith. Few people reach that stage. Those who do live their lives to the full in service of others without real worry or doubt. God is in charge. I am content in all things, Paul said. M. Scott Peck simplified this in terms of 4 categories. The first, chaotic, antisocial. People stuck at this stage are usually self-centered and often find themselves in trouble due to their unprincipled living. If they do end up converting to the next stage, it occurs in a very dramatic way. 2, formational, institutional. At this stage, people rely on some sort of institution, such as a church, to give them stability. They become attached to their form of religion and get extremely upset when these are called into question. 3, skeptic individual. Those who break out of the previous stage usually do so when they start seriously questioning things on their own. A lot of the time, this stage ends up being very non-religious, and some people stay permanently because they can never get beyond their skepticism. They don't have a path back in. 4. Mystical communal. People who reach this stage start to realize that there is truth to be found in the previous 2 stages and that life can be paradoxical and full of mystery. Emphasis is placed more on community than on individual concerns. What I like about Peck's version is it's not as age related. It'll give some flexibility if people in different points of life can encounter this. So what do you think of this? How does this then apply? How can you think about your ministry or your own life? What stages would you see yourself in? And what does that mean in light of how you're encountering theological learning and seminary training and other people's perspectives? What kind of questions are you asking? We want to avoid the questions of wrong stage or right stage, because the stage we're in is the stage we're in. This is where God is meeting us. Jesus didn't expect people to put on all the right clothes and have all the right questions before they can come to him. He met people where they're at. And so too we say that. We say Christian formation can exist in any of these stages, and yet in any of these stages it has to be oriented in a certain way. And part of understanding these disciplines, the discipline of Christian formation, is being able to be flexible in how we respond to Christian formation in our own life and in ministry. If you only know how to respond to one stage, you're not fully forming those in your ministry context. All right, well, let's turn to a specifically Christian approach to Christian formation by looking at Clement of Alexandria, who was the chief catechist of his city, Alexandria, Egypt, in the late 2nd century, distinguished 3 key stages of Christian growth, each involving different themes and different approaches. The divine logos, 1, invites people to salvation. So we can see this as applying to almost and new Christians. Those who are being drawn in by God, experience God's presence, but don't yet know or can categorize this, or don't quite know what Christianity is. So that's stage 1. Divine logos guides them to right action and healing of wrongly ordered passion. So we can see this as being for mid-level Christians. They're called to do the right thing, healing and reoriented in how they respond to the world. Anger is where we say, get over your anger issues or fears or addictions to certain things. Number 3, the divine logos teaches, explains, and reveals first principles, clarifying symbolic and ultimate statements. God draws people into a relational connection so that they understand who God is, not in terms of the do's and the don'ts. They are participating in a deeper way with God's presence and God's calling in their life. So this is for mature and advancing Christians. The problem in developing approaches to Christian formation is only seeing one of these stages as the goal. We only want to address the new Christian. We only want to address the seriously advanced Christians. We don't have anything to say to other. Or in applying the approaches of one to an audience in the latter. Well, then it just causes confusion, and they don't know what to do with it. It's not applicable. It's not where God is meeting them at. It doesn't help. I often hear how theology doesn't matter. Well, what does a specific theological issue have to do with a person who is hurting, or high schoolers? Why should we talk about Christology and a Trinitarian theology when there are people who are hungry? Well, that's confusing the categories. There are people who are in need to understand how we can navigate God's presence and God's identity as a way of putting together the pieces for their own life. Of course, we should help those who are hungry, but to say that that's the only thing we should do is discounting how developing formation draws us at different stages in different ways, and so we have different questions or different concerns or different barriers or different blockages. We don't want to halt people at a stage of growth, because if we halt people at a stage of growth, they stay maintained. You don't halt a 10-year-old and keep them 10. What happens if someone is in a 40-year-old body and has 10-year-old life? Well, it's just not right. And yet we do that a lot in churches. We expect people who are mature to just be maintained in this sort of teenager level of faith. At the same time, so people can reach the edge of learning and think they've heard it all. I encountered this early in college, where I'd kind of come to the end of what churches had taught me. And it wasn't addressing the issues of the massive financial problems my family was having that came out of my mom's massive health issues that she was experiencing. I wasn't the typical middle-class kid in youth groups, and they were trying to amuse and teach them in different ways. It didn't have anything. And I thought, well, this is it. What's the point? And then I started reading the church fathers, the early church, Tertullian and others. And they were speaking of a depth of faith in the context of persecution that radically transformed not only my understanding of God, but it transformed my understanding of Christianity. It was like I had lived my whole life in this tiny little room that was called Christianity, and then the door flew open and I realized there's a whole world out there. But the only reason I knew that is because I was exposed to early church writings. How many people are in that? So Christian communities can only mature as far as their leaders if there's a more authoritarian approach. If the leader is having so much control over things that they don't let other people have space, then the community will only have the reach that their leader does, which then narrows the discussions. It narrows the possibilities. It narrows people's growth in terms of what the Spirit is doing in their particular lives. So we need to be careful not to create a context in which people around us are limited only in what we see, or not to be in context where we're only limited by what one person is doing and what they know. Because unless that person is Jesus, we're going to be missing out on a broader, bigger work of the Spirit in our lives, in the community, and in our context. So what do we do with that? If each of those stages of life has its own kind of categories, its own themes, its own issues, its own concerns, its own ways of viewing the world, then how do we then respond in Christian formation? So one way of thinking about this is to think of in terms of each of those three categories: new Christians, mid-level Christians, advanced Christians, and each of then of the separate elements of triangulation. So in orthodoxy, we teach in new Christians, we invite them to salvation, understand the basics of Christianity, understand who Jesus is, what Jesus did, teach them scripture. Mid-level Christians teaches and heals. We give them an understanding of how to apply scripture to their lives, about how to understand what their own story and their own purpose, their own calling. Advanced Christians, we can talk about revealing an understanding of what God's doing in this world, clarifying issues and concerns and challenges or arguments. So we can, in each of these then, we don't want to talk about advanced doctrine with new Christians, and yet we don't want to focus on new Christians that we don't allow others to advance. So right thinking can apply to different Christians at different people at different levels of faith. So we need to be attentive to that and be attentive to where a person is. We need to be attentive to where we are. And like with exercise or anything, if just because you want to be at a different level doesn't mean you should be. If you want to run a marathon but haven't run at all, then you may kill yourself trying to get to the finish line, and you may never get there and become so discouraged you give up. But if you're running every day and you do that for a long time, and if you trained yourself, then a marathon's a natural step. You want to give yourself and other people space, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that recognizes what stage you're at and then applies the kind of learning information to that stage. So orthopathy, again, same thing. New Christians, we invite to salvation. Mid-level Christians teach and heal. Advanced Christians reveals and clarifies our passions. How are we loving each other? What does it mean to live in peace with another? Well, how do we respond to emotionally different contexts and different challenges and different issues, and becoming attentive to our passions, both in its positive sense, love, and negative sense, things that we might be addicted to, or where we find our identity or meaning or ego issues. How do we convey formation in terms of orthopathy to each of these three things? I'm not giving you specifics. It's part of the encouragement. Now, what would that mean in your context? I bet you can all think of people who are new Christians and people who are mid-level Christians and those who are advanced Christians. What would it mean to apply this approach to formation in those categories? Yes, it's complex, but ultimately, in addressing this way, we're not limited to a very narrow category, which again, churches often tend to be. We tend to group people tend to group together with other people who are at their similar stage. Well, then there's no diversity. There's no growth. Orthopraxy, same thing. How do we teach new Christians what to do? Mid-level Christians, advanced Christians. I like what Fowler and Peck oriented. And sometimes who are new Christians, they need a little legalism. Someone who's come out of a very disordered past and they've been caught up in a lot of behaviors. They need to have a set system of this is what you're supposed to do. This is what it means to be a Christian. Whereas someone who has walked in the faith a long time, the legalism is more constraining. So they need to find ways of living that out in freedom. We do this with kids. We have a lot of rules for young kids, and the rules may not change, but we give kids space to start making mistakes at times, or to explore their own sense of purpose and calling, how they're using their time. Orthopraxy. How do we orient what the right action is for people at different stages of faith? Someone who is a new Christian may not be able to give up the kinds of things that an advanced Christian is called to do. Someone, we say, just give up all your money. Well, some people just can't conceive of it. And yet for some people, with Anthony of Egypt, they were at this place in which that was what God was calling you to do. And it was just this natural step. Jean Vanier, in an interview about L'Arche, which I really like, I think it's part of the Templeton Prize speech he gave, or an interview that went alongside that. And he was asked, well, how did you do this? It wasn't this, and he said, no, it was an easy thing to do. It was just the thing for him to do, to start L'Arche. Well, that was because it comes out of his own formation. And yet for other people, that sounds like a very difficult idea, starting a home to work with severely disabled people and help spend your life helping them. But for him, that was the next step of orthopraxy. So each category has themes and approaches that relate to that. So what are the themes and topics and approaches in each of the elements and in each stage? Each category has particular elements, themes to teach in each stage. So can you say, well, what would it mean to teach orthopathy to an advanced Christian? I gave an example with Vanier with orthopraxy. Well, it would be helpful for you to go through and think to think of this in terms of specifics. What would orthodoxy mean to a new Christian? We're very comfortable with that. So introduce the basics of the faith. But for an advanced Christian, which is you're in seminary, suggests that you're needing this advanced training. We talk in a deeper level than I would talk with my 5-year-olds. Well, so the truth is, this can apply for orthopathy and orthopraxy. What would it mean to teach formation to a new Christian or orthopathy to a mid-level Christian? Come up with ideas that would fit your category. So maybe we can conceive of this in terms of at each stage of Christianity, of each stage of faith, and each stage of development. We should think in terms of what is it we should understand? Who should we be? And what should we do and not do? And if you see orthopathy as we should be and orthopraxy is what we should do, it's just helpful in conceiving people at different stages. We're in this common story of Christianity, but because we're all coming at it from such different places and different experiences and different histories, we have this complexity of the Spirit's work with us, not in terms of us having to live up to this category, but the Spirit meets us where we're at. Jesus meets us where we're at. And part of the ministry in teaching Christian formation is learning how to come to people where they're at and helping them see Jesus in that place so that they can mature in the power of the Spirit. Let's add more complexity, right? You're all advanced Christians, so we can do this. Different ages, right? How do you talk about formation to a 13-year-old? A mature 13-year-old is different than a mature 40-year-old, but maturity can be relatively assessed too. They're very immature 35-year-olds and some very deep, old soul 15-year-olds. So how do we conceive of Christian formation in terms of both physical age and emotional age? And we need to, again, not insist someone become someone else in order to find what God is doing, but to understand that we need to find ways of reaching them at where they're coming to so that we can lead them in new directions. Different spiritual gifts. People are going to resonate with different kinds of approaches to Christianity and different ways of responding and contributing. Different emotional or physical problems. Everybody has an issue. Everyone has a disability of some kind. I mean, people who have it all together, who have all the money in the world and all the looks and everything, they often have these emotional problems. It's those rare people that you hate who have everything together, but everybody has something. I've come to. Sometimes it's they're very socially put together and seem to have everything going for them, but you poke at the surface, everyone has something. Some people are it's more obvious or more socially not as fitting, but everyone has something. And so they have barriers to overcome. Everyone has barriers. And yet so often the church, as long as someone's socially together, they think it's fine and they move on. But we have to address the sickness. So if we think in terms of Christian formation, not just in terms of what we can teach them, but also ways to diagnose our spiritual state and to see assessing sins and assessing our own understanding and see that we all bring symptoms to this and we need healing in different ways. And to come to terms with that, people need, not all medicine is applicable to all diseases. A person doesn't go to a doctor and the doctor gives them the same pill. No, a doctor listens to what there's going on. He assesses and listens to their symptoms. He has them explain it. It's not a matter of judgment. It's a matter of coming to terms with what is going on in their life so that we can apply different ways of addressing those things, different paths of healing. Different contexts. Working in a seminary, has different elements than working in a prison or a hospital or suburban church. There's ways I'm talking about this in this context that I may not talk about it in other ways. And so we adapt our language, we adapt our complexity, we adapt our examples, our analogies, our sharing to this context. And so we have to be attentive to the context too, because if you don't know how to interact with a context, you won't apply the right way of approaching it. Different cultural challenges, different societies and different histories have different backgrounds that you need to understand. And a way of talking about salvation, for instance, to a 17th century German person was different than how we talk about salvation to a 21st century Japanese, right? Or we could go down the list. And different contexts require different kinds of understanding of where the Spirit is working, what the Spirit has already been doing, different learning styles. Some of you are really good about reading and learning from that. Some of you need me talking to go to something. Some of you are really challenged by being in an online class, and some of you really need the classroom experience. And yet some of you really resonate with online and are frustrated by classroom. We all have different ways of approaching learning. And so to understand Christian formation in terms of a multiplicity of learning, it's not just about getting up and lecturing at people. We have to approach it with different ways so that people are drawn in, different mental or emotional capabilities. There's some sense that in traditional approaches to Christianity, the best Christians happen to have the highest IQ because they can absorb the most complex theology. We think they must be a good Christian. Well, that's not true. Everyone is called, and we are all made in the image of God. And yet we bring to the table different abilities of thinking and emotions and different scars and different mental structures. And so we need to be attentive not just to the ultimate goal, but also to what a person can handle. Some people might be in a very concrete approach to faith, and they're not going to get past that because they mentally can't conceive of that the rest of their life. And so we need to understand that, not be judgmental, but understand how formation can value different stages of faith depending on who the person is, and to be aware of these capabilities. Some of the most brilliant people in the world are very emotionally stunted. Right? So we need to not dismiss just focus on the mental or just focus on the emotional. We need to be a bit understanding of capability. The list can go on and on. Each is important in understanding method and content information. And if we're not attentive to these elements, even in their complexity, we can easily cause more damage to people, just as if someone who has a set plan of physical training takes a group of people who have never worked out before and insists they do something that an Olympic athlete does. Well, if you do that, you're not just going to discourage them, you also might cause them physical injury. And so we do that spiritually and emotionally and educationally. We cause people injury by overtaxing them. Or we cause people to be undeveloped because we're not pushing them at the stage they need to go. If a Olympic weightlifter is using 5-pound dumbbells, they're not exercising. If a person who runs marathons is then said, no, you can run 100 yards every day, you can walk it. That's not helpful exercise. They were able to push their body farther, and so we need to give people space, both to fit their capabilities and also to give them steps to greater challenges. Formation. So facilitating Christian formation. If we're going to be attentive to Christian formation in our Christian communities, we need to be attentive to all these different elements. The Spirit's work is not general and homogeneous. The Spirit doesn't work in everyone the same way. That's fundamental to the nature of what we read in Scripture. The Spirit calls each person as a separate part. The body imagery, we're all different parts contributing. We don't have a hand do the same thing the foot does. If we have a stock approach or dismiss people because they're too mature, or if they're just asking hard questions that make us uncomfortable, we may miss out on the Spirit's work through them. We may be dismissing the Spirit's work in them. Like I've said a little bit, my experience involved coming to an end of what I could learn in churches. And when no one had any ability to answer the kinds of questions I was asking, I felt abandoned. I felt like I had maybe come to the end of Christianity. But then I found hope through early church writings. But that doesn't mean if someone's struggling in their faith and what's going on in their life that you just need to hand them a book of the Apostolic Fathers. That may not be what is helpful. You need to be attentive to that. Not everyone is in a place where they can find resources on their own as well. Fortunately, I was in a place where in asking those questions, I was in a context where I had to take an early church history class that was handed. And as I've developed, I have my Master's of Divinity and now my PhD. I'm very good about finding resources that help in particular issues so that I continue to form as a Christian. But not everyone is in a place for that. And so we need to be people who come alongside others and use our tools and training to help others find the resources that they need. The challenge for pastors and leaders, So no matter what you're going to do specifically in church, whether you're going to be a full-time pastor or just a volunteer pastor or other kind of leader, you're all now being trained to be leaders in the Christian community. So the goal is to listen to the Spirit at each point and offer a way of Christian formation for each person, to come alongside them, to help, to be helpful counselors, no matter what their place in their maturity they're at. You have to remember that God is infinite. God is beyond our capacity to fully understand. There is no end to knowing about God. There is thus no end to becoming formed as Christians. In as much as God is infinite and we're participating with Christ, we are going to be formed as Christians throughout eternity, we can say. Yes, there's going to be a place of fullness where we get so far beyond this we can't even conceive, and it will seem like it's everything, and yet God will be even beyond that, always drawing us farther. So Christian formation begins, but should never come to an end. We should never be at a point where we say we get it, because at that point we've stalled. Our approach to formation reflects our underlying understanding about God and God's work. How we engage in Christian formation says what we think about God. If we think God is a shallow God who only cares about certain basic issues, then we're going to teach people about those things, and we're going to be uncomfortable with anything else. If we think God is infinite and is involved in the complexity of this world, then we're going to talk about God in that way. How we engage Christian formation says a lot about who we think God is and what God is doing. So who do you think God is? What is God doing in your context? What is God doing in your life? And how can we bring your participation to fullness? How can you help bring others around you to fullness in understanding God's work and God's call in their life? That's the discipline of Christian formation.